This week, I was talking with one of my clients, a really good writer who was working on a fight scene for one of her characters. I'm not going to talk about the context because it doesn't matter too much, but she said something that gave me pause. She said, I really get anxious when I write fight scenes. It's really hard for me emotionally, and I kind of avoid them as a result. And I thought that was fascinating because I have lots of writers who conversely seem to overly love fight scenes, and they put them in everything, and they have these, training scenes and these fight scenes that I don't think always work well, because here's the thing about a fight scene. It can be really great in your novel. It can be necessary, whether you're writing something that's action adventure or something that is romance or writing something that's literary. Fight scenes aren't just battle scenes. They can be verbal arguments or they can be physical fights, but in every case, it's important to get them right. So I thought that in this episode of the How to Be an Author, I would talk all about those fight scenes, not just the physical fight scenes, not just battle scenes, but also emotional fight scenes, argument scenes, alternatives to fight scenes, the pros and cons of having a fight scene, the things that people get wrong with the fight scenes, how to prepare to write one, etc., etc. We're really going to go deep into this subject. I think it's going to be so useful for you no matter which genre you're writing in. So let's dive right in. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karena Akhavein, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Welcome to the How to Be an Author podcast. I am your host, writing coach Karena Akhavein. I'm a writer just like you, and I've been going through it for years now, finding ways to make my own writing go more smoothly, be more resonant with my reader. I've been trying to find ways to make the business of writing a little bit more streamlined and not burn out as I try to grow as a writer. And so I'm just a little bit ahead maybe on that road to writing success. And I love to share what I've learned with you, my writers, my coaching clients, and those of you taking my writing courses. So let's talk about writing a good fight scene, because this is something that I've worked on a lot myself, and I've worked a lot with other writers on how to do this right. Let's first talk about the advantages and disadvantages of writing a fight scene into your novel. The first thing that people realize right away is that a fight scene is going to heighten tension and excitement in your novel. This gives a burst of adrenaline in the story, and it keeps readers engaged and eager to see what happens next if it's done right. It also can help your character development because it provides opportunities for characters to reveal key aspects of their personalities. It shows their values. It shows some of their abilities. It can make a hero more heroic. How people respond to conflict deepens their characterization, and it can really create this empathy and this intrigue for readers. But again, if it's done right, if it's not done right, it can yank the reader right out of the story. So this is where you really want to be listening to this to know what is the right way to make my fight scene kind of really feed into that character development and work for me, not against me. Fight scenes also, they can be these pivotal moments that drive your plot forward. They're often important turning points in a story, but don't get lazy in doing that, because there is a right way and a wrong way to use a fight scene to introduce new conflicts, resolve existing ones, or set up future events. Fight scenes are an opportunity for really vivid visual imagery. It can paint this really cinematic picture. Oftentimes in movies, we've got fight scenes, and I think that those of us who are used to consuming this visual storytelling, we want to create that in our own books. And yes, if done right, it can create a memorable and immersive reading experience, but if done wrong, it makes your book fall flat. A well-executed fight scene can provide a sense of release or catharsis for both characters and readers, especially if the tension has been building. But that's important. You need to know how to build that tension and how to release that tension, because if not, you end up with a hot mess. What are the cons of fight scenes? Well, many times they're overused. Readers get desensitized. The impact is diminished. If every conflict is resolved through violence, this becomes repetitive and predictable, and we don't have that emotional payoff that we really are seeking in literature. With fight scenes that are not well done, sometimes you have these pacing issues that disrupt the flow of the story. It makes them feel like unnecessary filler. So, balancing action with quieter moments is going to be essential if you want to maintain the momentum and keep the reader invested. We're going to be talking a lot more about how to get the pacing right in your fight scenes. So, be standing by for that. Another major issue with fight scenes is the realism. This is a problem with many of my experienced and inexperienced writers who are writing these fight scenes that become super unbelievable because writing a believable fight scene requires a certain level of research, technical knowledge, understanding of combat dynamics. If you're not researching this right, and you're writing something in a way that's inaccurate, it can detract from your story's credibility. So it's going to take a little bit of research. And also then taking that research and not info dumping it, again, pacing for a good fight scene. But this could be really hard. Another issue is, this is what I touched on right at the introduction of this podcast, the discomfort. A lot of writers and readers feel uncomfortable or disturbed by graphic or gratuitous violence, and also the emotional thing. Some people have PTSD. Some people, need a trigger warning. So you have to be handling these fight scenes with sensitivity and avoid unnecessary gore or brutality, and also make sure that the fight scene is feeding your story and that it's required. You don't always have to have one. So if you think, this is not really going into my genre really well, I've written this lovely romance and then I have this like really disgusting fight scene all of a sudden, and, it's not feeding my story, don't have it. Right? If not handled carefully, fight scenes can devolve into these clichéd displays of machismo or superheroism, or your character all of a sudden it becomes this superhero that you're like, what's going on? You're undermining the complexity of your character. You're undermining the character growth you've been trying to work on. So make sure to include fight scenes only when they are relevant to the plot and when they actually help your characterization or advance your themes, not take away from them. So why do so many writers struggle with writing a good fight scene? Well, first of all, that difficulty, right? That not liking that violence, feeling uncomfortable or uneasy. I get that. If that's you, I'm not going to tell you to desensitize yourself. I'm going to tell you to look for some alternatives, and we're going to be talking about that in this podcast. But many times there's lack of experience. You've never been in a fist fight yourself. You've never been in a sword fight. Yeah, neither have I. So if you've not witnessed these things or participating in these things firsthand, it can be challenging to accurately depict the dynamics and the emotions of a fight. So this is where the whole write what you know thing comes in. You're going to have to dig deep to look for some parallels you can draw, some things where you can kind of imagine what that experience is and what those emotions are. I know that I actually went and I did some courses in shooting. I did some courses in boxing. I did some courses in sword play so that I could know a little bit better what those things feel like so that I could write about them. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. But remember that those emotions will be heightened because in my courses, I wasn't shooting people or punching people, except for my boxing instructor. But these things are really different. Oftentimes, writers have difficulty in visualizing action. You have to have this action. You have to look at it in this way that is cinematographic. You have to have a strong impression of the space that you're working in, the movements, and you need to know how to describe those in a way that works with your pacing. So that's going to take some practice, and it's going to take maybe beta readers who are going to be leading you on whether you're on the right track or not. Because many writers get super focused on the details because they, described all the details of a fight, and, they've got this pacing that they're thinking of, but they have all these details they want to get right. So then the scene feels a little bit cluttered, and you don't want that. Maintaining clarity is key, especially when you have multiple characters. And this is where it's the same as having a dialogue with too many characters. If you're having a fight with like all these multiple characters, whose fist was that? Whose foot was that? Whose sword was that? Who just got hit? Without the clear description, readers can get super confused and they're going to start skipping those types of scenes, and you don't want them doing that. So remember to balance realism with drama, realisticness with dramatic flair. It's got to be exciting, but you don't want to be sacrificing believability, and that's really important. And then too many writers, they don't remember that the good fight scene goes beyond physical action. It has to reveal something about the characters involved. And that's where writers are struggling to convey the emotional stakes of a fight effectively. And don't worry, again, this takes practice and it takes being really open to improving and editing something in a really smart way. This is where an editorial assessment can really, really help you. And if you're like, where do I get one of those? Guess what? Your writing coach, me, I do editorial assessments. I only do a few a month, but if you sign up, you have a chance of having one of those with me, and those can be really helpful. It's usually invaluable in knowing if you're heading in the right direction. I'll give you some feedback that's going to help you to apply it to every part of your novel. So what are some of the main mistakes that I see from my writers when they're working on fight scenes? Well, there are quite a few common mistakes, so don't feel bad if you've been making these, but listen to this because this could really help you to self-edit some of these scenes. Remember that a fight scene is not just the scene itself. It also has a lead up and an aftermath, right? So a lack of buildup is one of the first mistakes I see. Rushing into this fight scene without the adequate buildup robs it of its tension and significance. Without the proper context or foreshadowing, the conflict's going to feel forced or arbitrary, and that's not what we want. We need it to mean something. The other thing that people often do, and I talked about this a little bit before, but when you've done your research, now you're feeling like providing this excessive backstory or exposition. So if you're doing the info dumping, know that you're going to kill the momentum. You want to be integrating relevant information organically throughout the narrative and pick and choose as to those details that you actually need to use. Overly detailed descriptions are not going to be what serves your scene. Vivid imagery is awesome, but inundating the reader with every single overly detailed description of every punch, every kick, every block, this is going to bog down the scene and it's going to make it feel a little bit tedious. So we're going to be talking about how to do the correct description in your scene, but be really careful of the balance of that. Now, also think about your tone. Your tone is something that you've had, in your book. And if you're all of a sudden having a fight scene with a completely different tone, that's weird. Like you've gone from this high stakes thing to all of a sudden you go more lighthearted or ultra violence or something. This can be really jarring to your reader. So make sure that your tone remains consistent throughout the fight scene, but also that it's something that fits in with your voice, the rest of your novel. Because if not, your reader is going to be like, what am I reading here? Am I reading a different book? I don't understand. Now, another thing is, this is the after the whole fight, neglecting to show how the fight affects the characters involved, both physically and emotionally, during the scene and after the scene. All of this is really important. You cannot ignore the characterization because if not, it feels really shallow. So failing to address the aftermath of a fight leaves these loose ends and diminishes the stakes. And the stakes are so important. I had a writer who had written this really gory fight scene, and one of the characters had gotten this horrible sword wound. And then about an hour later, there's a love scene between this character and the heroine. And I'm like, okay, I'm no doctor. Well, I'm not that kind of doctor, but I don't think that character would be able to perform like that with the pain and the blood loss, and there'd be blood everywhere. This sounds really disgusting. And my writer was embarrassed at first, but had to realize that, yes, that was something that she needed to work on. The unrealistic outcomes are also something that are going to undermine a fight scene, right? If your character is the super underdog and all of a sudden their abilities just ramp up because they trained for a week. That's not going to work out too well. And we're going to be talking about training a little bit later in this podcast, but you definitely don't want to be super unrealistic. I know it's fiction, but it can't be ridiculous, right? And also remember that your fight scene is not happening in a vacuum. Remember the setting and the environment. This can really have a huge effect on how the fight goes, right? The weather, the obstacle, the terrains, other people around. This can add a lot of depth and complexity. And you don't want to forget that. And you also don't want to over rely on clichéd tropes and phrases. I know that many times in action sequences, there are some cliches and tropes, and they're fun. I get it, but you don't want to rely too much on them. So let's talk about what makes a good fight scene. A good fight scene is clear with action that's easy to follow. You want to be describing movements, actions, and emotions. It should be intense. So you're building up tension. You're using strong verbs and descriptive language to convey the intensity of that moment. And you cannot forget your characterization, right? It is not an important scene without it revealing something about your characters involved, their strengths, their weaknesses, their emotions. All of that is probably the most important thing about this scene. You're going to have the sensory details, but as I said, don't overwhelm your reader, but alternate between things with like sounds, smells, sensations, little snippets of information that immerse the reader in the scene without drowning them. Don't forget the stakes, so important. And then when it comes to the movements in the scene, you don't want like punch, 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 punch. Let's talk about a variety of moves and tactics so that the scene remains dynamic and interesting. And then, of course, the resolution, the aftermath of the fight, there has to be a change as a result of this fight. It's not just the wounded. It's not just everybody died. Like, things are happening afterwards. This scene, this fight had to change pretty much everything. Now, let's talk about this pacing of a fight scene because this is crucial for maintaining tension and engagement. There's some key aspects that you need to consider when you're writing this fight scene. You need a variety in tempo, right? A mix of fast-paced action and slower moments that are more like, tension or reflection. Rapid exchanges of blows, for example, can be interspersed with pauses. Your character's assessing the situation. They have run further away. They are thinking about what to do next. That's all really important, but it should be realistic. Think about a gradual lead up. Think about rising action. Think about strategic breaks and turning points. This is really great. These climactic moments are made of a series of turning points that maintain suspense. That's really great. And then you think of the resolution and aftermath. How can you make sure that your reader is going to be engaged throughout the scene? First of all, avoid monotony and also be clear enough that they're not going to start skipping things. That's really important. Now, let's talk about another one of my pet peeves, which is when writers make things so unrealistic because they get details about, the technicality of fighting or the weapons. They get it wrong, and this detracts from authenticity and credibility. Here's some common inaccuracies you want to avoid. Incorrect weapon nomenclature. If you're using these incorrect names for weapons, or if there's some anachronism, it can be jarring for those readers who are reading your scene with some historical knowledge. So it's important for you to be researching and accurately identifying specific weapons and also the names of things and their parts. You need to understand how certain weapons function. Right? So if you're inaccurately describing the weight of something, the balance of something, the range of a weapon, how you use a sword or a gun or whatever, this makes the fight scene feel unrealistic, again, for people who are familiar. And you know what? The people who care about these details, they're the ones who are going to be literally commenting and reviewing and, knocking you down for doing it wrong because they're obsessed. That's really important to realize that some people really know their stuff. Utilize those people. If you are aware of people around you who are proficient or familiar with a certain weapon, ask them about it. Ask them if you can borrow something, if they can teach you something. This is fun. This is a great opportunity for you to get out from behind your desk and get out into the real world and try something new. And that way it's going to feed your writing. The effects of weapons, sometimes Writers will talk about this lightweight weapon and it causes this excessive damage, or heavy weapons are being used, effortlessly. All of this is unrealistic. Another thing that's unrealistic is that weapons require regular maintenance. They can deteriorate over time. They wear out. And so many times I see people writing things where people have been toting around this sword and their sword is in pristine condition, or they've been swimming around with this gun. Well, is it still going to work? I don't know. These weapons could have wear and tear. You need to be thinking about that. Another thing you want to be thinking about is, how much training does my character actually need to use this weapon? And why are they using this weapon? This is something we're going to talk about in a second. And also think about different cultures. They have different weapon traditions, combat styles. You can utilize these in your book. That's pretty interesting. Now, one of my younger writers who's really fabulous, I'm so proud of her. She is, anyone who's sitting there saying, I'm too young to write a book, I have a very young 16-year-old writer who is so invested in her career. She has written 2 books already. I've had the pleasure of editing 2 of them, and I'm so proud of the progress she's made. And she has written things about training for fights, and she's learned so much. So I'm going to tell you how I helped her to approach the idea of training for a fight. This is a trope in literature, and you need to get it right. It's so easy to get it wrong. So the first thing is start by establishing the goals and motivation. Why is your character training for this fight? What are their goals? Are they preparing for a specific opponent, a tournament, or a life-threatening situation? Understanding their motivation is really going to shape their training regimen. Also, many times it's a character who is not trained to fight. Why are they the ones being put into this fight, we wonder, right? So how can we make our character go from non-fighter to fighting machine? This is such an interesting question, isn't it? That, what's going on and why them, why now? Because sometimes maybe your character wants it to be them because they are seeking revenge. Maybe it's them because they're the only ones left. Maybe they're secretly the chosen one, but they're not really comfortable with their newfound abilities. All these things are going to shape your training regimen in a specific way. Now, your character's physical condition is probably not awesome, right? At the beginning of this whole thing. How much time do they have to become physically fit? Too many times I see things that are described as like a 1-week training regimen. First of all, does your character actually have the time to practice? Do they have the time to get physically fit for this? What kind of exercises are they going to have to do? And, is this something that realistically they can improve in the time needed? But start to think about how that training looks. Is it cardiovascular? Is it agility? Is it flexibility? Describe that physical exertion, the sweat, the strain on their bodies as they're pushing them to the limit. All very important. Again, is it crucial for this character to be the one doing this? And what's that going to mean for their body in the future? Very important. Now, show how they're honing their combat skills through practice and drills, right? What are they doing? Are they blocking? Are they, progressing from novice to adept? Who's teaching them? What are the feelings of the person teaching them? The mental preparation is almost as important as the physical. Is there some visualization? Are there mental rehearsals? Is there meditation? How are they enhancing their focus and their confidence? Do they have the self-doubt and the fear? Are they building their discipline and their mental resilience? All of these things are important. And also, they should be trained in things like tactics, strategy, things that can compensate for their own weaknesses and kind of exploit their opponent's strengths and weaknesses. It's really important to talk about the analytical approach if that is appropriate in your character's development. And also remember that training isn't just linear. There are setbacks and challenges. Characters face setbacks and challenges. They get injuries, they get fatigue, they get self-doubt, and highlighting their determination and their perseverance is going to be a great way of showing a character who's growing and overcoming obstacles. And remember, the mentorship and the support is very important. Who's this character training them? Are they doing it against their will? Are they doing it because they used to be, really in this cause and they can't fight themselves anymore? Are they doing it because they're trying to train the next generation? All of these things are so important. So remember to incorporate all of those elements. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, a physical fight might not be really kind of crucial in my particular book. It might be wrong for what I'm writing. What other opportunities do I have to ramp up the conflict and tension, but without somebody beating somebody up? You can have a verbal confrontation. These can get really ugly. These can be just as gripping as a physical altercation. And it offers opportunities to showcase your character's wit, their intelligence, their strategic thinking, and also what's on their mind. It can often have a huge, huge fallout. If you say the wrong thing to the wrong person, or if you are saying things in front of others, this can have a huge, huge impact. You can also have a chase sequence. A chase sequence is a way of providing high-stakes action without resorting to direct combat. You still have to face dangers, navigate obstacles. You go through a lot of panic, so there's a lot of emotion. That can be really great. And then, if your character maybe is evading capture, or escaping something, this also involves a lot of quick thinking and a lot of that physicality without you having to beat people up. And then, of course, you've got the social manipulation, this intrigue, betrayal. All of that can be super tense. It's very mentally violent, but not physically violent, and that can be kind of good. And also, that psychological warfare, I think, really works. And remember that psychological warfare can be integrated into a physical fight as well. And then you can have things like competitions or contests. These don't have to be actual fights, but they still force your character to try to overcome. So remember that can be really, really important. But definitely remember, probably my top tips would be just to boil them back down. Remember the emotions during a fight. Think about the adrenaline, how that heightens the senses and reactions. It gives your characters a temporary boost in focus and energy, but then it leaves them shaky afterwards. Think about the fear. That can intensify at some points. Your characters are facing physical danger as the reality of the fight sets in. And then think about the different responses to fear. You might want to listen to my podcast episodes on fear. I have some on that specifically, and that can really inspire you. Think about the rage, the aggression. Think about focus or trying to, focus on too many things. And then think about the pain, the exhaustion, the discomfort. Right? And after a fight, I want you to really focus on the fallout, because this helps the reader to realize that this fight was not just a one-off thing that's over now. It has changed things. So what about the relief, right? The gratitude, especially when the stakes were high and the outcome was uncertain, that relief can be a major thing. Think about the exhaustion, right? Many times somebody has won the fight, but they're depleted. They've been hurt. They're exhausted. And now, how are they going to get back in the game? They might be feeling guilt or remorse. Many times, if you inflicted harm on an opponent, even if they kind of deserved it, or if the conflict had negative consequences for others, your character is going to be feeling guilt and remorse, over the obvious victory or triumph, right? That pride of overcoming your obstacles is often something that's mitigated by negative feelings as well. And characters can definitely experience emotional trauma or psychological scars from a fight that are going to last for a long time, especially if they witnessed or participated in acts of violence that conflict with their values and beliefs. Remember that these emotions can add depth and complexity to characters and help readers to empathize with them before, during, and after a fight scene. And that's the most important thing to remember, is that the fight is not just physical, it's emotional, and it has a before and after. And it has major, major ramifications on your story. If your fight scene does not feed your story and your characterization, it might not need to be there. So keep that in mind as you're writing your scene. Don't forget, beta readers, editorial assessments, definitely great tools for you. If you want to learn how to write a great fight scene, the nitty-gritty step-by-step workbook exercises, I have those in my course From Idea to Published in 6 months. If you're really serious about publishing in 6 months and having an author platform to boot, you are definitely, this is no battle here, no emotional battle here. You're going to want to take this course because it's going to make it as easy as possible for you. So that is it. I look forward to being with you next time on the How to Be an Author podcast. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.